Hi, welcome to the Morton Brown Family Wealth Intentional Wealth Update. I'm Katie Brown and I have my partner Dennis Morton here with me today.
Good morning.
Hi, Dennis. So we thought we would bring forward some of the different ways that we gather investing information and process it and work through how we think about the world around us. And I think that's changed quite a bit from the traditional methods of gaining investing knowledge. So one of the areas that we really spend time in talking about, collaborating in the office, are various podcasts. We're all big podcast listeners, and in any given week, we're having conversations around, what are you listening to? What did you learn? What do you think about this? And we're dissecting and pulling it apart. And it's fascinating conversations. So we thought we'd bring a little bit of that forward today and talk about our process. What do you think, Dennis?
Yeah, I think a lot of the information flow that you take in as an investor is about slowing it down. If you wanted to, turn on the news every day, watch TV or financial media, it's a constant barrage of information. The thing we love about podcasts is turn off the TV, slow it down, and find the right pace of intake. So today we're going to talk about an interview with Schwab's chief market strategist, Lizanne Saunders, where she just kind of talks about what's happening in the markets, but it's filtered through just kind of a slower pace, and it makes it easier to digest and better to understand. And then we're going to talk about kind of an unrelated financial podcast. We'll call it the after school special segment of this, but where we take a long view of some parallels to other facets of the world around us that can relate to investing. And those are two important pieces of the podcast world. We like the things that are specifically financial, but then the things that are just on the periphery that teach us about other ways the world is functioning and make us better advisors and investors.
One of the things that I really like about podcasts, which I think really resonate with me versus watching the news, is podcasts, I think, allows the time to build that context. We often talk about, what is the backstory? How does this fit into the context of what I'm trying to achieve or the world around us, or et cetera? And so many times with the news, you just get like snippets and flashes of this is happening, that's happening. It doesn't always go deep enough to understand the why. And I feel like with some of the long form podcasts, you can get more of that backstory. And I also love it too when you mentioned Lizanne Saunders. I really enjoy listening to what Lizanne brings forward. I think she has a great balanced approach to her thinking, and it's always data driven. And so I appreciate her way of thinking. And then she paired up. So the specific podcast that we're talking about today is the Morningstar Longview. Once again, a trusted source. I like the things they bring forward. So it's always nice when you have kind of two separate, trusted sources coming together.
Yep. All right, so let's dive in. So this was at the Morningstar Investors Conference recently, where Lizanne was being interviewed, and she talked a lot about what was happening with the threat of recession, how we even know the timing of things. She got into kind of some of the dynamics of the markets and the banks. Katie, what did you take out of this conversation?
Yeah. I loved that she zoomed back really far and took, once again, it's the Long View podcast, but she took a long view of what's happening. And she talked about in the beginning part, and then she went more granular later, but in the beginning, she talked about these large chunks of eras. Are we coming out of one era and perhaps returning, but with a different flair, to a different era? And so really talking about how the last 20 years were significantly different than the 30 years leading up to that. And there may be some things starting to repeat from like the 1960s on through the 1990s versus what we've been used to in our most recent decades. And it was interesting. Do you remember what she called the different eras? And because I think they're good descriptors.
Yes, she talked about the temperamental era and the moderation. Was it moderation?
The Great Moderation.
The Great Moderation. Right. So I think the Great Moderation, correct me if I'm wrong, was characterized by lower interest rates, smoother cycles, just things being relatively benign, long periods without bear markets and recessions and everything else. And now she said we're coming to this more temperamental phase, which we've seen before, but maybe just not for those of us about at this stage of our lives. You're approaching retirement. Maybe it hasn't happened since, for decades, but it's going to be characterized by more volatile inflation, more volatile rates, more volatile markets. And it's not so much a warning. I didn't get that sense. She's very good about not saying, now you need to go do something different. It's just recognize the era in which you're living.
Yes. Yes. And honestly, if we reflect back, obviously we had the great financial crisis of 2008. And this kind of catches the end of the dot-com bubble. But for the most part, once we started getting toward the end of the dot-com bubble, she called it the gelling period. And the gel going back to goods, energy, and labor, and saying, that was really when China started to, well, when China made a big impact on our goods that we received, because now they were contributing to the industries and they were producing a lot of the goods. And so it was this long period of disinflation. And we've talked about that as well.
Mhm.
For the longest time, the Federal Reserve could not get inflation up to 2%.
It was
It
an
was
enigma, right?
Yes, yes. And disinflation is where you get a little bit of inflation, but it's not keeping pace with other things. So it's
Mhm.
just kind of trucking along slowly. And so she talks about, the influence of China over that time, and even like energy over that time when the US started to take more control over their energy sources. And so things were just kind of gelling along for a long time. And it was just kind of moderation, but a lot of US growth.
Right. I think the caution, for if you're thinking about your financial plan in that context, okay, if I'm no longer living in the era of the Great Moderation, which might have encapsulated most of your career or the latter part of your career,
Mhm.
and we're coming into this more temperamental phase, things still might be going up and to the right. I think that's right. Things still might be going up and to the right, but they're going to be going like this. This is why we do video, so I can do finger drawings, but it's more volatile. Be careful about making decisions at the peaks or the troughs. That's the hard part. It's like we can be convinced, in the last couple of years, we've had very fast inflation, very fast disinflation. We've had, things moving quickly in one direction or the other. The challenge is not to get too emotionally invested one way or the other. And that's why I think if you're listening to a podcast and you get a reasonable voice like Liz Ann's putting things in context, it helps you to kind of stay the course on those things and not get too overwhelmed.
Yes. So, Dennis, if volatility might be part of the next era that we move into, what is one of the best ways to take volatility and try to moderate it? I'm going to go to diversification.
Good call. And which, by the way, is working fantastically over the last few months. I mean, if you look across the board, the concentration risk of having a few stocks that are doing really well, that worked for a while. It's not working so well now. If you're spread out, if you're invested internationally, domestically, if you own some bonds, some short and intermediate term bonds and balances of cash, diversification is working quite well right now. And you don't have to get it exactly right. That's the point. And even just that whole idea of eras, it takes away this need to say, what do you think is going to happen this quarter? I don't know. She had a line there which was, it's not what we know that matters, it's what we do along the way.
Yes.
That's the thing, and it's so true, because I don't know what's going to happen this quarter. She even said this. I have no idea what's going to happen this year, but we're living in this era, so make sure you plan accordingly and prepare mentally. So our second podcast. Now we're going to pivot a little bit to the right or to the left. So one of our favorite podcasts is the Odd Lots podcast from Bloomberg with Joe Weisenthal and Tracy Alloway, and their angle is to look at the financial markets, but to look at these dark little corners and places that you might not have thought about before. So they're always looking at things like what happened in the oil markets when prices went negative. Well, recently they had a podcast on the pending bourbon shortage, but it wasn't because of a shortage of the actual brown liquor, but they talked about the potential shortage in white oak, which is used to make the barrels for bourbon, and this potential decline. Katie, this was a fascinating interview, and really kind of, if you're thinking long-term, this is a long-term investment. It's really interesting.
That's what I loved about it, is because it made me adjust my mindset to long-term investing. We often think about long-term investing maybe being like 10 years plus, but these like 100-year cycles of forestry production
Mhm.
and growth, and how that supports industries. And even from the bourbon maker's standpoint, their bourbon needs to ferment inside of those barrels for 10 years. And so their short term is a 10-year cycle, but they have to think out much further
Yes.
than that. So it was a reset in my mindset, which was really neat. First of all, I loved the energy of this podcast.
Oh yeah.
They had a forestry professor from Penn State.
Calvin Norman.
Yes, Calvin Norman, and he was so fun to listen to because you could tell he just loved this stuff.
Yes.
And even for me, learning white oak is what's used specifically in the barrels, and there are only 3 types of trees that could be used for these barrels because most trees are more porous. And so if you're going to have the liquid in there for 10 years, eventually things are going to seep out. Whereas white oak, just due to its composite and its nature, will hold onto that liquid for an extended period of time. So it's just the natural makeup of the trees. But to listen to him go over the nuances of why these trees and the type of environment they need to grow into and how they need to be harvested and how we need to be thinking hundreds of years out, not just the next 10, 20 years.
Yeah, because he said there was something like a projected 77% decline in the white oak population in the coming decades. And the hard part is, it's hard to have an economic incentive to do it, to plant a grove of trees that's going to be matured and there long after any of us are even here. So it's an interesting dynamic how the distillers are working together with the forestry experts and everything, and farmers and everything else to try and pull it together. Katie, pop quiz.
Uh-oh.
The white oak is the state tree of what state?
Oh, Kentucky? I don't know.
Maryland.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. The white oak is the state tree and jousting is the state sport. So there's your factoids for the day. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
But yeah, so if you're looking for some good podcasts, I'll toss this over to you in a second. The way that I find good podcasts is I'll usually look for guests. So when somebody comes out with a book, like I remember Matthew McConaughey came out with a book, and I just searched him in the Apple Podcast app, and he's doing a book tour and being on any number of podcasts with different interviewers, different focuses, and it really gets the good interviewers will draw out stories from different angles, and it's a great way to just kind of explore and find good interviewers that way. If you just kind of look for the right guests, and it's a lot different from the talk show circuit. How do you find your favorite podcasts?
I don't know. Honestly, I think I just browse. And I look at topics and I look at different things and say, okay, maybe I'm in the mood to learn something over here today.
Mm-hmm.
I have my list of ones that are my favorites. Most of them are business finance related. But the thing that I love about some of even the finance related ones is that it can be totally different from what we do on a day-to-day basis.
Mm-hmm.
It gives an opportunity to learn something in like an unrelated but similar world. But I think a lot of it's through getting recommendations from other people. Yeah.
So as we wrap up here today, a quick teaser. We're actually recording a new season of our podcast that we have here at Morton Brown Family Wealth. So Katie and I are going to be tossing around some kind of behind the scenes discussions of running a business, how we develop as advisors and investors, and our perspective on advice kind of in this new era that we're in. So we look forward to sending those out to you this summer, and we look forward to catching up with you next time.
Yeah, and we'll make sure to post these podcasts that we referenced today. Just a little bit of a heads up, the long view can get a little bit jargony at times, but if anybody has any feedback or any questions with anything, we can probably answer more of the feedback on the Morningstar one. The bourbon's not exactly my area of expertise, but still fascinating. We'll make sure to post those for anyone that may be interested.
So until next time, talk to you soon.
Take care.